homeless man shared his wisdom. Unaware, he counseled a distraught CEO. The city never truly slept. Even at midnight, Chicago hummed with distant sirens, flickering streetlights, and the soft echo of traffic bouncing off glass towers. But for Daniel Carter, the noise felt far away, like life was happening to someone else. Daniel sat alone on a cold metal bench near the Riverwalk, his tailored suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, his phone dead in his hand. Just 12 hours earlier, he had stood on the 48th floor of Carter Global's headquarters, staring out over the city like a king surveying his kingdom. Now, he couldn't even bring himself to go home. His company was collapsing, and it was his fault. Daniel Carter wasn't just any CEO. He was the CEO, the kind business magazines loved to put on glossy covers. Visionary leader, self-made billionaire, man who saved manufacturing. Carter Global employed over 40,000 people across the Midwest. Entire towns depended on his factories. Generations of families had built their lives around his company. Daniel knew that, and that knowledge was crushing him now. Because the deal he signed 3 months ago, the one his board warned him about, the one he rushed through to impress investors, had turned toxic. A foreign acquisition, cheap labor, faster profits, and a lawsuit waiting to explode. By morning, the board would vote. If they removed him as CEO, Carter Global would shut down 3 plants within weeks. Thousands of people would lose their jobs, and Daniel would go down as the man who destroyed everything his father built. His phone buzzed weakly. 5% battery. Board member, R. Hastings. Daniel hesitated, then answered. "Daniel?" the voice said, sharp and tired. "We've reviewed the numbers again. It's worse than we thought." Daniel closed his eyes. "How much time do I have?" A pause. "Until sunrise." The call ended. No comfort, no reassurance, just a countdown. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the dark water below the bridge. He thought about his father, a factory worker who started Carter Global in a garage, a man who believed business was about people, not numbers. "You protect your workers, they'll protect your company," his father used to say. Somewhere along the way, Daniel had forgotten that. He rubbed his face, exhausted. "I ruined it," he whispered to no one. That's when a voice spoke from behind him. "You didn't ruin it yet." Daniel turned, startled. A man sat at the far end of the bench, wrapped in a worn coat, beard streaked with gray, shoes held together with tape. A plastic bag rested at his feet. Homeless. Daniel almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. He should have stood up, walked away. This wasn't his world. But something about the man's calm presence kept him seated. "Long night?" asked the man. "You could say that." The man nodded, staring at the river. "Worst nights usually come before the biggest decisions." Daniel glanced at him. "You're a fortune teller now?" The man chuckled. "No, just someone who's made enough mistakes to recognize the look." Silence settled between them. The wind cut through Daniel's suit. He shivered. "You shouldn't be out here. It's cold." The man shrugged. "Cold doesn't bother me as much as regret." That word hit him harder than expected. "Regret," he repeated. The man turned, eyes sharp beneath the fatigue. "You look like someone drowning in it." Daniel swallowed. "I'm about to lose everything." The man didn't react. No pity, no shock. "Everything?" he asked. "My company, my reputation, thousands of jobs. Funny thing is, I have more money than I'll ever need, and yet tonight I feel completely broke." The man studied him for a long moment. "Money doesn't keep you warm at night. Purpose does." Daniel scoffed softly. "And where did you learn that? Business school?" The man smiled, unoffended. I learned it the hard way." Daniel hesitated, then asked the question he didn't expect to say out loud. "What would you do if one wrong choice could destroy lives?" The homeless man leaned back, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city haze. "I'd ask myself one thing," he said. Daniel waited. "Will this decision let me sleep, or will it haunt me forever?" Daniel felt his chest tighten. "I don't know if there's a right answer anymore." The man nodded slowly. "There usually is. It's just not the one that makes you rich." Daniel stared at the man, this stranger with nothing, offering clarity when billion-dollar consultants couldn't. "You sound like someone who used to have a lot," Daniel said. The man smiled sadly. "I did." "What happened?" The man hesitated, then said softly, "A company forgot the people who built it." Daniel froze. The words hung heavy between them. He had no idea that the man sitting beside him once worked at one of Carter Global's oldest factories, or that the decision Daniel would make at sunrise would determine whether this man's entire community would survive. For now, they were just two broken men on a bench, one unaware he held all the power, the other unaware his words were about to change everything. The wind picked up, sweeping along the river like it had somewhere important to be. Daniel pulled his coat tighter around himself, but the cold had already settled inside his chest. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The city lights shimmered across the water, breaking into fragments, just like Daniel's thoughts. "You ever notice," the homeless man said quietly, "how the world keeps moving even when your life feels stuck?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly how it feels." Daniel stared at the ground, then let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief. "I wasn't supposed to be like this," he said suddenly. The man turned toward him. "My father," Daniel continued, voice low, "started our company with 10 workers and one rule. Never forget the people who make the machines run." He laughed, bitter and hollow. "And now look at me, sitting on a bench at midnight, hoping a stranger can tell me how not to destroy 40,000 lives." The homeless man didn't interrupt. He just listened. "I keep telling myself it's business," Daniel went on, "that layoffs are numbers, that closure's a strategy. But then I think about the families, kids, mortgages." His voice broke. "And I can't breathe." "I sign papers every day," Daniel whispered. "I make decisions worth millions in seconds. But tonight," he shook his head, "I'm terrified." The man nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. "Fear's not weakness. It's a warning light." Daniel looked at him. "From what?" "From becoming someone you won't recognize in the mirror." That hit harder than Daniel expected. Daniel glanced at the plastic bag by the man's feet. "You talk like someone who's been on both sides of this city," Daniel said. The man smiled faintly. "I have." "What were you before? Before this?" Daniel asked. The man hesitated, just for a second. "I worked in a factory," he said finally. 26 years, same place." Daniel's eyebrows rose. "That's a long time." "Long enough to raise a family," replied the man. "Long enough to think loyalty meant something." Daniel swallowed. "What happened?" The man looked back toward the river. "One day, the plant shut down. No warning, no explanation, just a notice on the gate." Daniel felt a tight knot form in his stomach. They said it was restructuring, said it was necessary. Profits were down. He laughed softly. "Funny thing is, profits went up the next year." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "And you? What did you do?" "I tried to start over," the man said. "But when you're 55, start over sounds real different." Daniel nodded slowly. "Lost the house, then the marriage, then the belief that hard work guarantees anything." Silence fell again. Daniel felt like the bench was shrinking beneath him. "What would you do?" Daniel asked carefully, "if you were in charge?" The man turned and looked him straight in the eyes. "I'd remember," he said, "that companies don't fail when money runs out." Daniel waited. "They fail when people stop mattering." Daniel felt his chest tightened again. "You really believe that?" The man nodded. "I watched a whole town die because someone in an office decided numbers mattered more than names." Daniel stared at the water, jaw clenched. He didn't know this man once worked at a Carter Global subsidiary, didn't know the plant closure that ruined this man's life was eerily similar to the one Daniel was about to approve. All he knew was that every word felt uncomfortably personal. The man leaned forward. "Let me ask you something," he said. Daniel nodded. "If you choose profit over people and you win, what exactly do you win?" Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. "I mean, really," the man continued. "More money? More praise? Another headline?" Daniel swallowed. "And if you lose," the man said softly, "but you protect people, what do you lose?" Daniel felt his eyes sting. "I don't know," he admitted. The man nodded. "That's the question that matters." A train rumbled overhead. Somewhere a siren wailed. Daniel checked his phone. 2% battery. "Mornin's comin'," he said quietly. The man nodded. "Decisions don't wait for us to feel ready." Daniel stood slowly, then paused. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to talk to me." The man smiled faintly. "Sometimes people don't need answers. They just need to remember who they are." Daniel looked at him, really looked at him this time. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. The man hesitated. "Frank." Daniel nodded. "I'm Daniel." Frank smiled. "Good luck, Daniel." Daniel walked away, unaware that the man he'd just thanked was directly connected to the decision that would define his legacy. Frank watched him go, eyes heavy with something between hope and resignation. "Choose right," he murmured. The boardroom smelled like polished wood and expensive coffee. Daniel Carter stood at the head of the long glass table, hands resting on its cool surface, eyes fixed on the city skyline beyond the windows. Morning light poured in, bright and unforgiving, nothing like the quiet darkness of the river bench from just hours before. 12 people sat around the table. 12 people who could end his career before lunch. "Let's begin," Richard Hastings said, folding his hands. "We don't have time for sentiment today." Daniel felt that word hit him like a slap. Sentiment. A screen lit up behind Daniel. Charts, projections, red arrows pointing downward. "Our overseas acquisition has triggered regulatory backlash," another board member said. "Investors are pulling back. Stock value is already dropping." A woman near the end of the table spoke next. "To stabilize the company, we recommend immediate closure of 3 underperforming plants." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew which plants. Older facilities, union-heavy, entire towns built around them. Frank's words echoed in his head. "I watched a whole town die because someone in an office decided numbers mattered more than names." Daniel swallowed. "If we don't act fast," Hastings continued, "we risk bankruptcy within 18 months. Someone else added, "This is about survival." Daniel straightened. "For whom?" he asked. A few heads turned. "For the company," Hastings replied sharply. "And the people?" Daniel asked. "The ones who gave their lives to build it?" Silence. Then a scoff. "With all due respect," a board member said, "we can't save everyone." Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment. Frank's voice again. "If you choose profit over people and you win, what exactly do you win?" "We need your signature, Daniel." Hastings slid a folder across the table. "Approve the closures today, reassure investors tomorrow." Daniel stared at the folder. 3 plants. Over 6,000 jobs. communities that would never recover. He imagined Frank standing at a factory gate, notice in hand. "You're asking me to sign away people's lives," Daniel said quietly. "We're asking you to do your job," Hastings snapped. Daniel felt something inside him shift. "Before I sign anything," Daniel said, "I want a full report on Plant 17. The room stirred. "That plant is already on the list," someone said. "I know. That's why I want details." A junior analyst hesitated and spoke. "Sir, Plant 17 was scheduled for modernization 5 years ago. Funding was redirected." Daniel's eyes snapped up. "Redirected where?" The analyst glanced at Hastings. "Executive bonuses." The room went quiet. Daniel felt heat rush through his chest. "Say that again?" The analyst swallowed. "The plant wasn't failing," he said. "It was neglected." Daniel laughed softly, disbelief edging into anger. "So we starved the plant, then blamed it for dying." No one spoke. Hastings leaned back, annoyed. "That's ancient history." "No," Daniel said, voice steady now. "That's accountability." He pushed the folder back across the table. "I won't sign this." Gasps, murmurs. "You're risking everything," Hastings said coldly. Daniel thought of the bench, the river, the man with nothing who had everything figured out. "Maybe, but I'm done pretending numbers are more important than people." 2 floors down, in a maintenance hallway, Frank stood holding a mop, security badge clipped to his coat, temporary janitorial work. He glanced up as executives passed by, unaware of who he was or that his life was once again tangled in theirs. He didn't know Daniel was fighting for him. Not yet. But for the first time in years, something felt different. Daniel knew the moment he stepped out of the boardroom that nothing would ever be the same. The hallway felt longer than usual, quieter. Conversations stopped as he passed. People who normally greeted him with easy smiles suddenly found their phones very interesting. Retaliation doesn't always come loud, he realized. Sometimes it comes cold. By noon, his assistant knocked gently on his office door. "They've scheduled an emergency vote," she said, eyes worried. "Closed session." Daniel nodded. He'd expected this. "They're moving to suspend you as acting CEO," she added softly. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Today?" "Yes." For a moment, the weight of it pressed down on him, his name on the building, his father's legacy, the company he'd given his life to, about to be ripped away. Frank's voice echoed again, calm and steady. "Decisions don't wait for us to feel ready." Daniel stood. "Thank you," he said. "Whatever happens, I'm glad I didn't sign." Across town, in the shadow of rusted smokestacks, Frank stood at the edge of Plant 17. The gates were locked now, weeds pushed through cracked concrete. The Carter Global logo still clung to the brick wall, faded, peeling, forgotten. Frank hadn't planned on coming here, but after his janitor shift ended early, his feet brought him back without asking permission. This place had been his life. 26 years earlier, Frank Morales was more than a factory worker. He'd been a line supervisor, then a union representative, the man workers trusted when machines broke, when hours were cut, when rumors spread. When Plant 17 started losing funding, Frank had written letters, filed reports, warned management. He'd even traveled to headquarters once. They never let him pass the lobby. Then the closure came. No severance worth mentioning, no retraining, no explanation. Frank lost his job, then his house, then his wife, who couldn't live inside uncertainty anymore. And slowly, he lost himself. Frank sat on the curb, staring at the locked gates, when a familiar voice cut through the quiet. "Frank?" He looked up. Daniel Carter stood there. No suit jacket, no entourage, just a man who looked as tired as Frank felt. "You work here?" Daniel asked gently. Frank stared at him. "You?" Frank said. "You're the CEO." The air shifted. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Or I was. I don't know anymore." Frank let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "All those words last night. You didn't tell me who you were." Daniel shook his head. "And you didn't tell me who you were either." Frank stood slowly. "Plant 17 was my life. I tried to save it." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "I think you almost did," Daniel replied, "but someone chose bonuses over modernization." Frank's eyes widened. "You know?" "I know now." They stood there, two men connected by a decision made years ago, and another one being made right now. Daniel's phone buzzed, a message from Hastings. "Board vote passed. Suspension effective immediately." Daniel stared at the screen. Frank saw his face fall. "They got you," Frank said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I chose people," he said, "and I lost power." Frank shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "you chose people. That means you gained something else." Daniel looked at him. "Trust," Frank said, "and trust is worth more than any title." In that moment, Daniel realized something. If he walked away now, the company would go back to business as usual. But if he stayed and fought from the outside if necessary, he might still change the ending. He looked at Frank. "Will you help me?" Daniel asked. Frank didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. "I've been waiting years for someone to ask." The headline hit before Daniel even made it home. Carter Global Board suspends CEO after dispute over plant closures. Daniel stared at his phone as notifications stacked up like falling dominoes. Emails, texts, missed calls. Some from reporters, some from old friends who suddenly just wanted to check in. Some from people he hadn't heard from in years, angry, hopeful, desperate. The story was no longer his alone. By noon, news vans lined the street outside Carter Global headquarters. Commentators argued on television. One man's integrity, one anchor said, is another man's recklessness. Online, the public was louder and harsher. But something unexpected happened. Workers from Plant 17 started posting. Photos of the factory in its prime. Stories of decades spent on the line. Names, faces, families. And one phrase kept appearing again and again. "We mattered." Frank watched the coverage from a small community center, standing beside a dusty coffee machine and a flickering TV. People from the old neighborhood had gathered. Former workers, spouses, kids now grown. Someone recognized him. "Frank Morales?" a woman asked. "You were the union guy, right?" Frank nodded. "You tried to warn them," another man said. "You told us this would happen." Frank felt something tightened in his chest. For years he'd felt invisible. Now, suddenly, people were listening. A local reporter stepped forward. "Sir," she said, holding out a microphone, "you worked at Plant 17 for over 2 decades. What do you think about Daniel Carter's suspension?" Frank hesitated. Then he thought of the bench, the river, the question Daniel had asked him. Frank spoke. "He listened," Frank said simply. "That's more than most people in power ever do." The clip went viral within hours. Daniel sat alone in his dark apartment, tie draped over a chair like something abandoned. His father's old watch lay on the table in front of him. He picked it up, turning it in his hands. A message buzzed on his phone, from his ex-wife. "I saw the news. I hope you're okay. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you." Daniel closed his eyes. He'd lost his marriage years ago to the same obsession that nearly destroyed his company, always choosing results over relationships. Now, stripped of title and power, the loneliness felt sharper, but strangely, cleaner. That evening, Daniel met Frank again, this time not on a bench, but in the same community center where the old workers had gathered. They talked strategy, options, legal paths. "We can't save everything," Daniel admitted, "but we can force transparency." Frank nodded. "And remind people who built this place." Together, they drafted an open letter, not as CEO and worker, but as two men taking responsibility. By morning, it was everywhere. And for the first time since the closure notices went up years ago, hope returned to the neighborhood. The courtroom didn't feel dramatic. No shouting, no sudden confessions, just polished wood, quiet tension, and the slow grind of consequences. Daniel sat beside his lawyer, hands folded, listening as Carter Global's board justified his suspension. "Emotional decision-making," Hastings said smoothly. "Dangerous leadership." Daniel almost smiled. The board's attorney spoke at length about shareholder duty, market stability, and fiduciary responsibility. "Mr. Carter endangered the company by refusing necessary closures," he concluded. Daniel finally spoke. "Necessary for whom?" he asked calmly. A few heads turned. "For profits," he continued, "or for people?" The judge raised a hand. "Stick to facts, Mr. Carter." Daniel nodded. The facts were finally on his side. That night, Daniel returned to the old family house, empty now. Dust settled thick on the shelves. He stood in his father's study, surrounded by framed photos of factory floors, handwritten notes, and early blueprints. He found a notebook. Inside, his father's handwriting. "If the company ever grows so big that it forgets one worker's name, it has failed." Daniel sat down, overwhelmed. This wasn't about saving plants. It was about restoring a soul. Across town, Frank stood in front of a mirror in the community center restroom. He barely recognized the man staring back. Years of anger, years of silence. He'd blamed the company, blamed Daniel's father, blamed himself. That night he spoke to the group, not as a spokesman, but as a man finally honest. "I let that closure define me," Frank said. "I stopped fighting for myself." The room was quiet. "But I won't let it define our future." Something shifted. The next morning, evidence surfaced. Internal emails, deferred maintenance budgets, executive bonuses tied directly to plant neglect. The judge reviewed the documents. So did the media. Carter Global's stock dipped, but public trust surged. The board panicked. Hastings called Daniel. "We can negotiate. Reinstatement, quietly." Daniel looked at Frank across the table. "No," Daniel replied. "Not quietly." He hung up. Everything was on the line now. The courtroom was full this time. Not just lawyers and executives, but workers, families, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder. Some stood along the walls because there were no seats left. Frank sat in the second row, hands folded tightly, heart pounding in his chest. Daniel sat at the defense table, calm on the surface, carrying the weight of thousands of lives beneath his stillness. The judge entered. Everyone stood. "I've reviewed the evidence," the judge began, "including internal communications, financial records, and testimony." The room held its breath. "It is clear that Carter Global's plant failures were not caused by market forces alone, but by deliberate underinvestment paired with executive self-compensation." Murmurs rippled through the room. "The suspension of Mr. Daniel Carter was retaliatory in nature." Frank's breath caught. "I am ordering Mr. Carter reinstated as CEO, effective immediately." The room erupted. Some cried, some hugged, some simply sat in shock. Daniel closed his eyes. But the judge wasn't finished. "However," she said, "this court also recognizes the company's financial reality." Silence fell again. "Plant 17, she said, "can be saved, but not without significant restructuring." Daniel stood. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "I accept full responsibility." The board looked confused. Daniel turned to them. "I will forego my compensation, bonuses, stock options, all of it." Gasps. "For the next 3 years, my salary will go directly towards modernizing Plant 17 and retraining workers." Hastings shot to his feet. "You can't." "I can," Daniel said quietly. "And I will." Frank felt tears blur his vision. Within weeks, the gates of Plant 17 reopened, not as a relic, but as a promise. Modern equipment arrived, training programs launched, workers returned, not just with jobs, but with dignity. Children watched their parents put on uniforms again. Local shops reopened. The town breathed. And for the first time in decades, people said Daniel Carter's name with something other than resentment. One morning, Frank stood on the factory floor once more, hard hat at hand. Daniel approached him. "I need someone I can trust, someone who understands both sides." Frank frowned. "I'm not a suit." Daniel smiled. "That's exactly why I need you." Frank Morales became Community Operations Director, a bridge between leadership and labor. The man once ignored at the gate now held keys to the building. Frank looked around the factory, emotion choking his voice. "I never thought I'd be back." "Neither did I, but here we are." That evening, Daniel returned to the riverbench alone. He sat where it had all begun. Frank joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Funny place to change a life," Frank said. Daniel smiled softly. "Funny who ends up doing the changing." They sat in silence, watching the water move forward, always forward. 1 year later. The city still moved fast. Traffic still honked. Screens still glowed. People still chased deadlines like they always had. But for Daniel Carter, life had slowed. By choice. He no longer rushed through hallways without looking people in the eye. He no longer measured success only in quarterly earnings. Some mornings, he walked the factory floor instead of the executive wing. And every once in a while, he sat on a bench by the river. Carter Global was no longer the fastest-growing company in its sector. But it was stable, honest, human. Plants once scheduled for closure now trained workers for new technology. Towns that had been written off were rebuilding. Slowly, imperfectly, but together. Daniel's name still appeared in business magazines, but the headlines had changed. The CEO who chose people over profits. He didn't frame those articles. He framed thank you notes instead. Frank Morales started his mornings early, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He walked the floor with workers who trusted him. He listened to concerns before they turned into anger. He remembered names. All of them. Sometimes younger workers asked him how he ended up in his role. Frank would smile and say, "I sat on the right bench at the right time." But he never told them everything. Some wisdom doesn't need explaining. One evening, Daniel and Frank sat together again by the river. Same bench, same quiet water. A well-dressed man approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," the man said. I'm having a rough night." Daniel looked up. "Sit," he said gently. "Tell us." As the man spoke about fear, pressure, mistakes, Daniel listened. Frank listened. Neither interrupted. When the man finished, Frank spoke first. "Will your choice let you sleep or haunt you forever?" The man froze. Daniel smiled softly. The wisdom had found a new home. This was never a story about a CEO losing power. It was a story about a man remembering his soul. It was never about a homeless man gaining a job. It was about a voice that deserved to be heard all along. Because real wisdom doesn't come from titles. It doesn't wear suits. It doesn't demand attention. It waits quietly, on benches, in shadows, in people we overlook every day. If this story moved you, remember this: the advice that saves your life may come from the person you almost walked past. And if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe, because the next one might change the way you see the world too.